Hello, hello, hello. Happy Tuesday. I almost said happy Wednesday. This is why I say happy whatever day it is, so I can remember what day of the week it is. But when I say it wrong, then that confuses me and other people. So happy Tuesday. It's Hummingbird Hour Day. Thank you everyone for joining us and being here, whether you're watching with us live or whether you are watching the recording after the fact. We're glad you're with us. Hummingbird Hour is our weekly conversation series that we're running in May, June, and July this year, 2021, and celebration of our 1-year anniversary, which was in May of 2021. It's very exciting. We hit a year. Yes, I for those of you who are here for the first time, I launched a business at the height of the pandemic, as did one of our panelists today, Bryce, who maybe will share a little bit about that with us. And so both of our businesses have survived for a year since we started them in the pandemic. So I'm super excited about today's conversation with Bryce Salado and Ben Greene, who are both openly transgender individuals who will share about their lived experiences and about the work that they do to help create spaces that are more inclusive and welcoming of everyone. And today's theme is beyond pronouns. Many of us have put our pronouns on our signature lines and on our I'm going to take off this welcome screen here, have put our pronouns on our signature lines and on our LinkedIn profiles. And that's an awesome step, and there's more to it. So we're going to hear more about that from Bryce and Ben today. Before I disappear from the screen, though, I should mention who I am for those of you who might not know. I'm Brian McCormick, and I'm the founder of Hummingbird Humanity. We are a consulting firm that works with organizations to create human-centered workplace cultures. And Bryce and Ben are both part of the Hummingbird team. So you're in great hands. With that, I'm going to pass it off to them. I will be in the background. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'll be adding some links in the chat as well. And I'll be back at the very end just to share a couple wrap-up comments. So with that, off to you, Bryce and Ben.
Thanks, Brian. Bryce, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll introduce myself and then pass it off to you, Ben. Thanks, Brian, for introducing us, kind of doing some level setting. Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. Really excited to have this conversation with y'all and alongside one of my favorite people in the world, Ben. So with that being said, my name is Bryce Salado, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm a senior consultant with Hummingbird Humanity, and I've been working with them for basically the entire year that we've existed. In addition to supporting Hummingbird, like Brian mentioned, I also have my own business, Swarm Strategy, where I do very similar work, really focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, racial justice in the workplace, LGBT inclusion. So a little bit about my background. As Brian mentioned, I'm an openly transgender person. I identify as transmasculine. I use he, him pronouns, and I have started my transition when I was roughly 18 years old, and I'm 29 now. So it's been about 10, 11 years. And my background before I got into doing diversity, equity, and inclusion and consulting work, I worked at several national LGBT organizations doing transgender advocacy, transgender policy work, LGBT policy work. So I worked at the National Center for Transgender Equality. I worked at the National LGBTQ Task Force. I've also been a board member at several LGBTQ and trans-focused organizations. So that's kind of the perspective and angle I'm bringing to today's conversation. Being someone that has roughly 10 years of experience when it comes to implementing and creating and writing policies and programs that are specifically designed to support transgender people and especially actually trans youth. I have a lot of experience working with transgender young people as an educator, as someone who worked on LGBT education policy specifically for several years. So really excited to just kind of share some of my background and knowledge with you all today. And again, to get to do that alongside of Ben. So I'll pass it off to Ben.
Thanks, Bryce. It is I always love sharing the virtual stage with you, Bryce. If you can't tell already, Bryce and I like each other professionally and also personally like each other a lot. Bryce is one of the smartest people that I know. So I'm super excited to be here. You might recognize my name. I'm at all of the Hummingbird Hour events dropping links in the chat and helping to support in the background. And now I'm here in the foreground. So very excited to get to be sharing my own story and my own voice today. So my name is Ben Greene. I use he, him, his pronouns. With Hummingbird, I wear a lot of hats. I do project management, data science, speaking, consulting, all that good stuff. And then outside of Hummingbird work, I also run my own business as a transgender inclusion consultant and speaker. So I speak at companies all over the world, at international conferences like Diversity Live, companies like NASA, Northwestern Mutual, FactSet, all different domains, religious organizations, and schools. Anybody who is ready to learn, I'm ready to teach. And that is my philosophy. So I haven't been doing this work for quite as long. Formally, I've been doing trans inclusion work for about a year and a half. Informally, I was one of only 2 transgender people in my entire hometown, so I was the designated educator from the moment I came out. So I am very used to answering a lot of questions I didn't know was a job people had until I gave a TEDx talk in the spring of 2019 that got quite a bit of traction on the internet, and a number of people found it and said, "Hey, would you come and speak for our company?" And I said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know this was a thing people did for a living. I want to do that." So I changed everything around so that I could make that my life's work, or at least my life's work so far. I guess I can't really say my life's work at 21, but that is what I love doing and get to do now. So I'm really excited to be here in this conversation today, just talking about, so many people are kind of in a place where they're like, all right, I got my pronouns in my Zoom name and let's pack it up, everybody. Next issue, we're good to go. And it is definitely like, it was so exciting to see all of the momentum towards, including pronouns and things. And that momentum is just kind of like, it plateaued and has dropped off a cliff now.
That's a really good point, Ben. And that's one of the reasons why we're here today. Really is to share with you all some strategies and some tips on ways that you really can think about including trans people and make a more holistic way in your workplace. So I think it's really critical that you mentioned that, Ben. And I just want to before I pass it back to Ben, I just want to do a little more context for y'all, why this matters, going beyond pronouns, as Ben said. So oftentimes for transgender people, particularly in the context of workplace settings or jobs, we face incredibly high rates of discrimination in the workplace and harassment in the workplace. And it's still legal. Well, in many states, it's still actually legal. It was legal to, still fire people from jobs simply for being transgender. I don't know if people are huge Supreme Court nerds like I am, probably not. So, you might not have heard that last year in 2020, there was actually a case in the Supreme Court, the Bostick versus Clayton County case, which did rule that the 1964 Civil Rights Act actually protects LGBT people, including transgender people, from workplace discrimination based on sex. But even with that Supreme Court ruling, it's really hard to actually implement that in practice because there's actually no federal legislation that protects transgender people. So even though we have the Supreme Court ruling, which in theory, now makes discrimination illegal in workplaces for transgender people, we still face incredibly high rates of workplace discrimination, again, simply for existing. So that's just a little bit more kind of political context for why we're here. And then, sorry, Ben.
Oh, I just wanted to say, as an additional note about that Supreme Court ruling, is that literally 2 weeks after that ruling, I was fired from a job for being transgender. So there are a lot of ways that people are finding their way around it. And there was nothing that I could do in that situation to because I was hired as a contractor, or it was through Florida, and a various number of loopholes that they found where there was no way to implement that ruling. But that everyone sees okay, you got marriage equality, we got that other Supreme Court ruling, and we're all set. And that's really far from the truth. Bryce, do you mind if I go into some information about the bills? So something that is really important to highlight is that there are a couple of big Supreme Court victories, but on the state and local level, the attacks on transgender people are exploding in a way that I think it's more than the last 10 years combined, the number of anti-trans bills that are being proposed and passed. And to give you just a different way to look at the magnitude of that, I'm going to show you all a map from the Equality Federation that is a tracker of all of the anti-trans bills. So you can see these are all of the states that have anti-trans bills pending or passing. So for states like Texas has 12 bills, Missouri, where I live, has 10 bills. Oops, I clicked on it. Missouri, where I live, has 10 bills. Those are the pro-transgender bills. Sorry about that. Computers never get any easier. Even with my computer science degree, I still don't all the way know how to use a computer. So there are just bills in so many different states that are doing a lot of different attacks on transgender people, especially transgender youth and their parents and their doctors. So as an example, there is a bill in Texas that sought to include supporting a transgender youth in the definition of child abuse, or other bills like in South Carolina, where if any government employee has any suspicion of gender nonconformity, they have to report it to the parents. So a therapist, a teacher, anyone who suspects that a child might be trans, they have to tell the child's parents, which is just horrifying. I know for me in Missouri, I was watching a lot of the bills that were looking to make it illegal to provide gender affirming care to people under 18. And there was a brief conversation about expanding that to 21, which I recently turned 21. And, there was a time where I really felt like I was going to have my access to healthcare taken away, my access to transition related care and gender affirming care taken away. So it was just really, really scary. And in a lot of these states, what has helped is people calling state legislators and saying, here's why this bill is damaging, it's hurtful, I'm a doctor, I'm a parent, I'm a trans youth, here's why this bill will hurt me or will hurt trans youth. And so like the governor of Arkansas was going to pass a bill that would ban gender affirming care for trans youth, got so many calls that everyone said, it's really dangerous. He came out and made a statement and said, it seems like it's just going to hurt people if I let this bill pass, so I'm going to veto it. And he was immediately, they overrode the veto and it has gone into effect, which is really, really horrifying. But just goes to show that, people can do something, but people don't think they can, so they don't bother trying, which is really, it is sad and also frustrating. People are like, well, there's already over 100 anti-trans bills pending. What can I do about it? Guess it's going to be nothing. Guess I'll put my pronouns in my LinkedIn and call it a day. So I think just understanding that there are so many issues that transgender people are still facing in the world and in the workplace as well today that are impacting the way that we show up.
Yeah, and I think, Ben, it's really important to note, like, you might be sitting here asking yourself, like, oh, well, like, why does this legislation matter in the context of work, right? Or you may be sitting here saying, like, oh, my company doesn't have any transgender employees, or like, I don't work with any transgender people. And the reason why that's like kind of like a really like problematic way to think about this is, one, you likely actually do work with transgender people, right? So there's also a lot of research and a lot of data that shows LGBT people in general, but particularly trans people, are more likely to be closeted at work because they don't feel comfortable or like don't feel safe coming out. So just because, you might not think you have a trans coworker, chances are you actually likely do, right? And that person might be questioning their gender, or might be at the very early phases of their transition, so they're still kind of thinking about it, or maybe they don't feel safe to truly be who they are. And the other thing that Ben mentioned that I just want to highlight and kind of make a connection to the workplace with is, Ben mentioned that a lot of these anti-trans bills are targeting trans youth specifically, which again can even be expanded to 21 years old, as the example that Ben gave. And several other states are including 21-year-olds in that definition of youth. So that impacts, people work in two ways. One, thinking about kind of like service industry jobs or retail jobs that typically have younger people in the workforce, or are kind of seen as like high school teenage jobs, right? If you have employees in those fields that are 16 to 21 years old, and they can't access the care they need to truly be their whole selves and to feel comfortable and to feel safe in who they are, that's a huge factor, in terms of them being able to show up at work and really do their jobs without that strain, without that kind of burden on them. And I think a conversation that we don't really have enough in the workplace in general is thinking about parents at work, right? So if you work at a company, or if your company has someone there who is a parent to a trans youth, imagine the stress and the strain of knowing, hey, my child might not be able to access the care they need to be happy, to be successful. So you might be thinking that, this legislation kind of lives in a separate kind of world, right? Or, oh, it's just about politics, it's just about policy. But these policies have real world implications on transgender people and on parents of transgender youth every single day that can really just like make it challenging at work for them to then feel comfortable just doing their job and being themselves. So I wanted to make that connection for folks, as Ben gave us some really great background on the legislation piece of all this.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that we have kind of some context and we've done some level setting, I think what we really want to talk about is what more people can be doing. Not to say that pronouns aren't important, but it would be like if you were making a cake for a birthday party and you took out a platter and you plopped some icing on the platter and then you showed up to the party. The icing is a really important part of the cake, but without the cake, it doesn't do a whole lot. So there are a lot of places that don't have structural support that people need, in addition to what we're kind of going to be calling today surface level support. So we're going to go through some examples of things that are surface level support. So as an example, pronouns are the biggest one, that it's very visual. So there are some companies that say, okay, everyone add their pronouns and that's it. And there's not even any education behind it. So people don't know why they're adding their pronouns. It's just like a quick email they got that says, please put your pronouns in. The next level of that is having one trans speaker or one trans event. So that's still surface level because, it's only an hour out of a year and it's not changing any policy, but it is helping to change culture. So bringing one person in for a pride event can be really nice, but doesn't create a magnitude of change that is needed in places where people need support. A lot of times I go and I meet an employee resource group to talk about bringing me in as a speaker, and they say, yeah, we're an ERG, we have absolutely no budget, we don't get to talk to the CEO, we have no way to communicate with anyone. So creating ERGs is really helpful, but keeping them siloed off and with completely under-resourced and no ability to have any impact is a way to make that systemic change into a surface level change, to say we have the structure set up for you to make a difference, but we're going to put up a wall so that you can't do that. So really finding ways to support those ERGs. And then the last one is doing something like having inclusive bathroom signage is surface level support versus, having gender neutral bathrooms, which is actually supportive of trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people, because you can have signs that say, oh, men's bathroom, but like however you identify, women's bathroom, but however you identify, but there are still going to be people who fall into those buckets who aren't comfortable using one of those bathrooms. And so a structural support is having a gender neutral bathroom. So that's a couple of surface level supports. Bryce, do you want to talk about some more structural supports?
Yeah, I do. But before I do that, actually, I just want to elaborate on some of the really key points you made in terms of the surface level. Thinking back about pronouns, especially, the title of this event is Beyond Pronouns. And a lot of Ben and I's work with Hummingbird, when we're doing other sessions and other workshops, questions that people ask us all the time are like, oh, like, why do pronouns matter, right? And Ben said something that's really important. And that surface level piece, where like a lot of organizations will, as Ben said, will ask folks or will mandate folks to put their pronouns in, but without that education piece, right? So that piece around like why pronouns matter and that education piece, that's one way where you can kind of start building that bridge between like the surface level and like the systemic changes, right? And something that like Ben and I always like to say when we answer that question is, there's kind of this misconception that trans people like invented pronouns somehow, or that like pronouns didn't matter until trans people all of a sudden appeared in the year 2020 or 2021, right? And like I like to kind of push back against that, because like, one, everyone uses pronouns, like transgender and non-transgender people, right? You say, oh, she left her jacket, or that's his book, right? Like everyone has a pronoun that they feel comfortable with, regardless of whether or not you're transgender. So I think that's something in terms of thinking about how do you bridge the surface with the systems, like that very basic piece of understanding, like, okay, why are we doing this, right? Like, why are we putting our pronouns in our bio, or why are we putting our pronouns in our LinkedIn or in our email signatures or on our Zoom? Well, like, one, because we all use pronouns. Two, because, it does make transgender transgender and gender nonconforming people more comfortable and more seen oftentimes. And three, like, transgender people have existed literally since the beginning of history, particularly in a lot of indigenous cultures before colonialism. A lot of indigenous cultures really valued gender expression and gender diversity that was outside of what we would call kind of like the norm, or outside of like the binary of male or female. So I think highlighting those reasons, like why are we doing this, is also a huge part of going from we're just going to do these icing on the top. I love that analogy, by the way, Ben. Icing on the top changes versus actually baking the cake, right? So with that, I'm kind of here to share, how do we bake that cake? What are those ingredients that you kind of need before you put the icing on top? And I think something that I have a couple points I'm going to hit on. And something I immediately think about when I think about, how you make workplaces inclusive for transgender people in a really holistic way is healthcare access. And Ben mentioned that, talking about legislation, how a lot of these bills are targeting trans people being able to access the healthcare that we need to survive in many, many cases. And before I really dive into this, I just want to say the caveat that not all transgender people medically transition, and that's okay. That doesn't mean they're any less trans. It doesn't make their identity any less valid, right? So not every trans person wants to access hormones or wants to access surgery. But for a lot of us, and I'll speak for myself in my experience, accessing hormones and accessing, gender affirming surgery was very, very important to myself becoming who I wanted to be and becoming the best, most authentic, happiest version of Bryce. So a really good starting point when we're thinking about how do you create structural change at organizations for trans folks is looking at your healthcare policies, looking at the insurance plans you offer, and making sure that they are trans inclusive. So for myself, I was unable to access the surgery that I wanted to have, my chest surgery. I was unable to have that surgery for 8 or 9 years, simply because out of pocket, I could never afford the cost. So top surgery, as it's commonly referred to, is generally $7,000 to $12,000 out of pocket. The price can vary in that range. And as a Black, queer, transgender person who grew up in a low-income family, that was very, very inaccessible to me for years and years and years. And the only reason I was finally able to have top surgery about 3 years ago was because my employer at the time, it was my first job after graduate school, and my employer at the time had very, very good trans inclusive healthcare. So instead of paying, likely $10,000 out of pocket for this surgery, I paid $40. That's right, 40. I paid $20 for my surgery copay and like $20 for my pain meds afterwards. And that was a really, really life-changing thing for me. Having to spend $40 on something versus $10,000, that literally made my day-to-day experience, just like as a person, just like infinitely better. Even when I got recovered from surgery and went back to work, my coworkers noticed a difference. They were like, oh, like you seem happier, you seem more comfortable, you seem more laid back. I was actually a teacher at the time, so my students even commented like, oh, Mr. C, like you just seem like, like more relaxed. And I was like, yeah, I feel a lot better. So, thinking about like, does your company have trans inclusive healthcare, especially if your company, it is Pride Month right now. I think it would be we have to mention that it's June, it's Pride Month, obviously. And so many companies in June, do like to bring in Ben and I to do Pride Month talks, or they do like to have their ERGs throw events, or they do like to highlight, oh, we put our pronouns in our Zoom, but then they don't actually offer trans inclusive healthcare, for example, right? And like that's a huge disconnect. If you're publicly saying, oh, we support LGBT people and we support trans people, and oh, look, we brought Ben in to do this amazing talk, but then you have trans employees who can't access the healthcare they need, that's really, really challenging. And it goes beyond, gender affirming care like surgeries and hormones. It really is also just like day-to-day stuff that transgender people, just for like things like a common cold, for example, have a really hard time finding, doctors that are affirming. So if your organization has kind of like those resources or has a database of LGBT affirming doctors, that those are also just huge steps that your company can take. And I'll let Ben he looks like you want to dive in. So
Yeah, two things that sparks for me. One is making sure if you have those policies that people know about it too, that you are
Mhm.
public about it. So I was talking to a client the other day, I was doing a speech and someone came on and said, do you know of like, when will we have trans care covered in our health insurance? And the person was like, oh, we've had it since 2018. And all of these trans employees were like, I have been waiting for so long. I asked you and you said we didn't have it. And then you got it and you forgot to tell us. So for like making sure that you are really public about what resources you have, there's no reason it needs to be hard to find. And you know what Bryce said too about things like the common cold, there's something called the trans elbow phenomenon, where a trans person goes to the doctor and says, I broke my elbow. And the doctor says, well, sorry, I don't know how to treat trans people. There's nothing trans about my elbow. Like it's just like a person elbow, but it's a very real thing that it's really hard to find any type of doctor that knows how to be kind and sensitive and inclusive in their language. So I might have to travel further for a doctor's appointment. I worked at a job where if I needed a doctor's appointment, I had to take the whole day off of work because I had to go into New York City instead of, I couldn't find anyone in my small town in Connecticut that was gender affirming in the way that I needed. So being understanding that it is hard to access all types of doctors, not just what people might think of as the like only like trans specific care, because all care is unfortunately trans specific care in the minds of a lot of doctors. So making sure that you have that understanding that you might need to be a little flexible with time off for doctor's appointments as well.
Yeah, that is also a great point, Ben. I too used to live in a rural area of Western Massachusetts, and lucky enough, that part of Western Mass, was really LGBT friendly and very LGBT, just like welcoming, and there was a lot of queer folks there. But even in an area of the country that was very, welcoming of LGBT people, I still sometimes would have to go about an hour and a half to Boston to access medical care as well. So that's a really common experience. And like you said, having time off policies, PTO policies that really honor that and allow trans people to take that time is really critical. So I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. And another thing that really goes with healthcare policies, in my opinion, at least, or in my head, is also thinking about parental leave policies and policies just around reproductive health in general at your organization. This has become really popular. I moved back to North Carolina recently from the Bay Area. And in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, there are a lot of tech companies, and a lot of tech companies and kind of bigger companies have recently started creating policies, around reproductive health specifically. So, paying for people to freeze their eggs, for example, or paying for people to have IVF. And so oftentimes when we talk about reproductive health, we use very gendered language, right? We talk about women's health and women's health care. And I've seen that a lot written in company policies. And, realizing that, other people besides people who identify as women have kids, right? Carry children, or might want to carry children, might want to freeze their eggs, might want to have IVF, people who are gender nonconforming, non-binary, also, transmasculine people, trans men. I know several trans men who have carried children. I know several trans men who want to carry children one day. So if your company does have policies around reproductive health care, just ensuring that those policies are really gender inclusive by not using gendered language like women's health, or thinking that women are the only people that can get pregnant or want to get pregnant. And along with that, thinking about your parental leave policies is also a really, really critical way you can be trans inclusive. So oftentimes companies will have great policies around maternal leave, right? Like, oh, if you're a mom and you just adopted a kid and you just had a kid, we'll give you 3 months off or 4 months off or whatever that time frame is. But oftentimes those policies, one, aren't really inclusive or equitable of dads or parents that might identify as male, and dads have a really hard time getting time off, paid time off work. And that's something I think about as someone who really, really wants to have a kid one day and is really looking forward to that experience. It's just how oftentimes, fathers don't get the same amount of paid time off as mothers do, right? And then even going a step beyond that, thinking about parents that, again, are non-binary or that, identify as genderqueer, and how you can really ungender a lot of the language in your policies around parental leave. So, instead of saying, company X gives new mothers 4 months paid time off. That policy can very easily be rewritten to say, company X gives new parents, right? Like just being mindful of language, I think is a lot of this work, quite frankly, when we're talking about writing trans inclusive policies. A lot of it is just being really mindful of language and how we're talking about people and their identities. Ben, yeah, please.
And I think just remembering too that so many of these changes will support so many people. So there are non-transgender, the word for that is cisgender, in case that's a new word for you. So there are cisgender dads who all men deserve paternal leave if they've had a new kid. All people of all genders and all identities deserve paternal leave, or things like changing tables in restrooms. There weren't changing tables in men's restrooms and still aren't in most places because the idea that a dad might need to change a diaper is so there are so many things that we talk about being inclusive of trans people, and trans people are a lot of the people that are driving this movement, but that benefit everyone. Yeah. Which is just so important to highlight.
Yeah, and even going, I know I know this is again beyond pronouns, but I want to go back to the pronouns for a second, because this is something that has come up with Ben and I when we do training sessions and we talk about pronouns. Someone shared with us recently, they have a daughter and their daughter's name is Blake, and their daughter, like an email or written communication form, people often assume that, oh, her name is Blake, so she must be a boy, right? And uses male pronouns for Blake, and Blake has to correct people and be like, no, I'm a girl, I use she, her. And so folks with gender neutral names, this comes up a lot in terms of pronouns. And again, the example of parenting, like Ben said, dads just often don't have that same access or same benefits to time off and the workplace. And especially now with COVID, and people are largely still working from home. I know some companies are returning to office, but a lot of folks are still working from home, right? So just being mindful of how folks are balancing parenting challenges and time off and needs around parenting with also working from home, and how that does impact folks of all genders. And then there's a couple more things I want to highlight, and then we're going to have some time for Q&A, and I'm also going to shout out some organizations that you all can support that are trans-led and trans-inclusive. But again, Ben mentioned how the majority of states right now are trying to pass or are successfully, unfortunately, passing anti-trans legislation. And as we go back into the world, like I mentioned, I know folks are returning to offices, people are getting vaccinated, things are kind of opening up again, right? So we're going to start seeing things like conferences happen again. I actually love a good work conference. I really, really miss workplace conferences. And as we see conferences come back into the world, one step that your company can take or organization can take to really show their commitment to transgender people is not having these conferences that bring in tens of thousands of dollars to local economies, not having them in states that are trying to pass anti-transgender legislation, right? And really making a commitment to know we're only gonna host events or host conferences in states that everyone can feel really welcome or feel really included. Because imagine, I'm actually currently in Texas right now, visiting some family down here. And I was really nervous, quite frankly, about this trip because, Texas is one of those states that pretty vehemently this last legislative session tried to pass a lot of anti-trans legislation, and the governor and many legislators were very, very open about where they stood on transgender issues and when it came to transgender people. And so imagine, if your company is like, oh, we're gonna host our annual retreat in Houston this year, and if you have transgender employees, they may feel really uncomfortable or really unsafe going to those states, knowing that, oh, this state is trying to legislate which bathrooms transgender people can use. And, how can I feel comfortable at a conference here if I always have to have that fear in the back of my head or worry about that? Or, oh, how can I feel comfortable going to a work conference or a work meeting, in this state if I know the state is literally trying to restrict healthcare access for myself and people like me? So, as we go back to in-person work events, conferences, meetings, annual retreats, I just really encourage that, your company or organization be mindful about where you are physically having those, and are they in states are they in places that are actually safe for transgender people? And then if you're regularly hosting events in these states that are, again, openly trying to pass legislation that makes it impossible for transgender people to even exist, quite frankly, then, you're not doing right by your transgender employees. You're not doing right by any of your LGBT employees, quite frankly, and you're sending a message to those employees, and as a larger company, sending a message that you either don't care or you just don't want to try to educate yourselves, and it's just like makes it really, really hard then for us in those situations. So Ben, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, just building off of that, if we look at some historical, it's like 4 years ago when there was the North Carolina bathroom bill that was being proposed, and there was a big deal about, they were basically said that trans people are not allowed to use the bathroom that lines up with their gender identity. And all of these people kind of rallied around the trans community and said, we're not going to stand for that. Artists pulled their concerts, and the Final Four was moved, and all of this stuff got pulled out of North Carolina. North Carolina said, all right, bill's dead. It's done. It's over. We're not doing that. And it worked. And, that same thing, people aren't doing that this time around. And part of it is because there are so many more states. You have to really you have to mean it when you say, I'm not supporting states that are trying to attack trans people. It has to be a conscious effort, but trying your best to do that. And that's what shot down that North Carolina bill. And these bills didn't all get proposed at the exact same time. It was a trickle and then a stream, and then the dam burst. But when they first started coming out with a lot of these bills this year, people weren't saying things. People weren't saying right away, okay, I'm not making your state get more revenue for tourism or for taxes or what have you. I'm not engaging with you. People didn't say that. So then all the other states said, all right, what happened with North Carolina isn't going to happen again. Cool. I'm joining the party. And so they were following each other's lead, which is really just horrifying to see. But, it does work. It has worked in the past, and it will work again if people are willing to commit to it.
Yeah. And Ben, that's a really great point. Like, organizations, like workplaces in the United States, have a lot of power because of how our economy is structured, because of how our whole society is really built around work. Quite frankly, organizations and companies, particularly like larger Fortune 500 companies, have a lot of power in the United States. So, if they are saying, hey, we aren't gonna, invest because you are, attacking trans youth, because you're attacking trans people, that does go a really long way. And, I want to shout out one of my favorite people in the world, but one of my favorite people on Twitter in particular is Chase Strango. He is a transmasculine person who is a lawyer with the ACLU. He was actually one of the lead lawyers that argued the Bostic case that won in the Supreme Court in 2020 that I mentioned. And Chase has been very, very vocal just in general, but he uses Twitter as his main platform. And, something he's been saying for years, quite frankly, but really recently elevating this message is, if all these companies that rainbow wash their logo for Pride, so again, it's Pride Month, so all these companies are putting rainbow logos on everything, and they're selling us rainbow t-shirts and rainbow socks, and they're making special commercials that are like, look, we have a gay couple in our commercial, and like, we love gay people. And something that Chase has been saying, and I've been saying, that Ben's been saying, that a lot of us have been saying in the community for years, is if all these companies that wanted to profit off of us during June, that wanted to profit off of us during Pride Month, actually invest it in fighting anti-trans legislation, fighting anti-LGBT legislation, actually invest it in local LGBT centers, actually invest it in, trans youth organizations that supported trans young people. If all these companies that put rainbows on their logos in June did this work throughout the year, we wouldn't see the intensity or level of anti-trans hate that we have seen escalating for, the past several years. So I really, encourage folks to just go follow Chase. He's great. And, to really put your money, especially if you're a larger company, to really put your money where your mouth is, right? Instead of just putting rainbows on your logos during June. So then again, that goes back to that systems versus surface, right? Like putting your logo that's rainbow in June, and then, the minute July 1st comes, changing your logo back and everything is kind of back to the status quo. That is a very, very kind of surface level approach. So going beyond that to really take a deeper systemic approach. So with that being said, I just want to highlight a couple more points. One thing that another step that organizations can really take to support trans employees in a more holistic way is really, creating, supports for trans employees that transition in the workplace, right? So having a plan in place proactively. And again, you might be saying, we don't have any trans employees at our organization. Again, you probably don't know. And two, even if you don't right now, you want to make sure that your workplace in the future is set up for success to really have a transgender employee come in and not only, feel safe, but be able to really show up again as our authentic self. So creating those support systems. So you might be saying like, well, what does that look like? A friend of mine recently shared this example with me that I think really highlights what I'm talking about here. So I want to share this brief little story. So a friend of mine works at a therapy agency, and recently one of her coworkers decided to transition. And her agency has a rule or a policy in place that you have to work at the organization for 1 year before you switch departments or before you switch roles. And this person who was transitioning hadn't met that criteria yet. They hadn't worked there for a year, but they had transitioned recently, had transition related surgery, changed their name, had really gone through all the steps to become who they wanted to be. And this person wanted to change departments because they didn't want to have to go back to their kind of old department and have to explain everything, and instead wanted to have a fresh start, right? And that way they could just show up as who they were, and they didn't have to kind of jump through the hoops of being like, yes, this is why I changed my name. Yes, this is why I took several weeks off to have this surgery. And the organization, they had that policy that was like, well, you can't really change departments or change roles because you haven't been here for a year yet, right? So that trans person kind of had to, push back a little bit, and ultimately they were able to switch departments and were able to switch roles so they could have that fresh start. But like thinking about like small things like that, right? That you might not think of as like a trans related thing, but allowing someone to transition roles or transition departments so they can just be themselves and not have to explain why they took time off or why they changed their name. That is, one way you can proactively be thinking about, okay, like, do we have support systems in place to support, transitioning employees or transgender employees? And another really big thing is trainings and workshops, right? So Ben mentioned at the beginning, oftentimes we being Ben and I are asked to come into an organization and, give a talk, like talk about being trans, or like tell your story, or like, what was it like? And we love doing that kind of stuff. And that's a great first step, but that's really what it is a first step. So one way you can create those like structural changes and make sure that you proactively have the supports in place is, do continuous training, particularly with people who are people managers, right? Or people that work in HR. So everyone in your HR department, they should go through a training that is specifically about transgender inclusion and transgender best practices, right? Not just an LGBT 101, but very specific to the experiences of transgender people. Because while trans people do have similar experiences in some ways to other, people who are part of the LGBT community, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer people, in a lot of ways, we face very specific challenges that cisgender LGBT people don't, right? So one way you can make a structural change is, yes, bring Ben and I in for your Pride events, and make sure that your HR team and that your management team and your executive team is being trained on transgender inclusion best practices, especially when it comes to hiring, right? So for example, having places on your applications where people can put their name that maybe isn't their legal name, right? Background checks are a really big issue for transgender people because oftentimes companies run background checks on people, and that will likely unintentionally out a trans person, right? So whenever I apply for a job, now I have my own business, so I don't have to worry about this anymore. But prior to starting my business, I was unemployed for several months at the beginning of COVID and applying to a bunch of jobs and interviewing for a bunch of jobs. And they would always ask if I had a former legal name, right? So of course, legally, I would have to put my my birth name on this application. And most of the time it was fine, but there were definitely a couple instances where hiring managers would ask me questions about it, or, you know, it would just be a really uncomfortable situation. So thinking about your HR team, like training them on those things, like, well, how do you handle background checks with transgender people who may have a different birth name? How do you know, in an interview situation, how do you make sure that you're asking appropriate questions that won't out them or won't make them feel uncomfortable? So these are all just more examples of how you kind of start building in those structural practices to really support trans folks on a deeper level, particularly in hiring and management practices.
Yeah, something that I want to add to, and talking about being ready for someone to come out, something that I think is so important that people don't think about is name changes within company systems. So this isn't exactly workplace, but I, came out right before I went to college, and I didn't change my name legally until I was 3/4 of the way done with college. So for a long time, I had the name that I went by, which is Ben, and my birth name that was in all of the systems. And I came out, I told them I was trans, they had no problem with it, and they would change it when I said, hey, it shows up on my student email. We'll change your student email. And then 3 weeks later, I'd get a letter in the mail that would have the wrong name. And I would say, hey, it shows up on my mail. And they would say, great, sorry, we'll change the name on the mail. And then it would show up in my financial aid. So they hadn't thought through all the places it would show up. And at no point did they say, let's sit and find all the places your name might be. I had to kind of let them know every time. So I was constantly in a state of like, I might see my birth name today and I really don't want to do that, but I might get a piece of mail addressed to, for a while it was weird. They hadn't fixed it. So it was addressed to Miss Benjamin, my old middle name, Greene, which was a very weird hybrid that they had only set it to change my first name in the system. So, thinking through where are all of the places someone's name, a security badge, payroll, mail, employee reviews, anywhere it might show up, so that when someone comes out, you can just change it in all of the places at once rather than have the person have to keep letting you know where else it shows up. And I think oh, sorry, Bryce, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was affirming what you were saying and saying that I was laughing, not because I was not laughing at the experience. I was laughing because I too have had like very similar experiences, both in education settings and work settings, particularly the weird salutation thing you mentioned, right? Where it's like, Mr., my birth name, my birth first name, my current middle name. And it's like, this makes no sense. Why would anyone's name even be like this, right? So I just wanted to affirm what you were saying. And like, I share that I was laughing because I've had like very similar experiences. I think that's true for a lot of transgender people, particularly when it comes to names and databases and yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the note too of, transgender people not being out, for me, one of my first jobs that I had while I was in college was that I worked as a preschool teacher. I worked with this preschool for 2 years, and I never told them I was trans because I was waiting. There were no other trans people that I know of that worked there, and I was waiting for a sign. So my first day on the job, I walked in and the kids were like, oh my gosh, are you a girl or a boy? Which also, like, every trans person I've ever met has had that question asked of them. But so they said, oh my gosh, are you a girl or a boy? And I was like, ready to explain because I was transgender and like ready to be a teacher. And the head teacher of the classroom said, he's a boy. We don't ask that question. His hair is short. Like, that's inappropriate. And I was like, okay, guess I'm not going to be talking about that here. And I had top surgery while I was working there. And I was so afraid that people were going to figure out I was trans from guessing about my recovery that I would pick up things I wasn't supposed to lift and like try and hide that I was in recovery from surgery. Or if like something came off and started bleeding, I would like go and hide in the bathroom instead of asking the nurse for help. So like all of these things, because there was no indication to me that it would be fine. There was no indication to me that it wouldn't be fine. No one ever said, I don't like trans people, I'm transphobic. Like, no one ever said that to me. If I came out, it probably would be fine, but there was no guarantee. And there was, at that time, no ruling in any way protecting me from being fired. So I was like, it's not worth it. They use my right name, but it's just something that I had to like hide. So there are a lot of people who are waiting to see that the support systems are there because they don't want to be the guinea pig. So they're waiting for you to say, okay, we're all ready. We have our, trans inclusive healthcare. We have everywhere. We can change your name if you want. Then someone says, all right, it seems like, you've finished building the parachutes and now I can jump out of the plane, rather than like, let me jump out of the plane with some like a tarp and a sewing kit.
No, and Ben, that's actually like a perfect place to kind of like wrap up and transition into, you know, opening Q&A up and whatnot. Because I think that is like really the crux of what we're trying to get at. And like the perfect message to end on is that really the biggest thing as an organization, as a workplace, as a manager, as an HR department that you can do, it is really be, again, I mean, use the P word, proactive and transparent, quite frankly, about, you know, what your company does have in place, what your company needs to have in place, and how your company is, you know, working to rectify those areas that you still have gaps, right? Because I think that's the other thing that I've heard from managers or I've heard from executives before is like, oh, well, like, I'm scared of getting it wrong, or I'm scared of like, you know, messing up, or we don't have everything in place. So I don't want to like, you know, pretend like we do. And like my answer to that is always, that's okay, right? I think literally like having written down in your HR guidebook, having it in your, if your organization has an intranet, like an internal internet or social media system, you know, anywhere that you all have your policies laid out for your organization, I think it's really critical to clearly state like, hey, here's what we do have, right? We do have gender affirming healthcare policies, or we do have gender neutral restrooms in our office. And hey, like here's what we don't have, and we acknowledge that, and here's how we're like working to get better, right? So that's just the reality, is that many workplaces like don't have these protocols in place, right? Or don't know how to talk about it. So like in that absence, like Ben was saying, in the absence of concrete policies and that absence of concrete guidance, many employees just aren't going to feel comfortable approaching their HR department, right? Or approaching their manager about their gender identity, or about, you know, saying like, hey, here's what I need to be successful. So I really encourage you all, you know, to take a lot of the tips that Ben and I have shared with you all today. Also, I'm actually working with another colleague of mine on finalizing a guidebook that will be coming out in the next week or so that is focused on these issues, that is specifically about how organizations can support LGBT people in the workplace in general. And a huge section of that workbook or that guidebook is about transgender employees and what companies can do. So a lot of kind of like the policy guidance I've laid out today, I will go into more detail about, well, the guidebook goes into more detail with, I should say. So as soon as, you know, that resource is completed, I'll make sure that we have it on the Hummingbird. That it's accessible for folks, basically, is my biggest desire, that resource is helpful and accessible for folks, so that we'll have that. And I just want to shout out some organizations really quickly, that if you're like, oh, like, you know, it is Pride Month, like how can I be supporting trans people, or, you know, what other organizations can I be donating to, or, you know, oh, I want to learn more about the Equality Federation and the work they do. So I just put a list in the chat of some organizations that hopefully y'all can see. I definitely encourage you to check out their websites. And something that Ben said earlier before folks got on the call that really resonated with me, that I just want to share, is so oftentimes, again, especially during Pride Month, people are like, oh, where can I donate money to, or how can I help? And honestly, I really encourage folks to look up, you know, the grassroots local organizations in your community or in your state that are supporting transgender people. So for example, I'm in Texas right now, like I said, visiting some family. And in Texas, there's a really great organization called the Transgender Education Network of Texas, aka TENT. And they are a small but mighty team, really doing the work here on the ground every day for trans Texans. Ben and I both have New England ties, and in New England, there's the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, MTPC, again, another really great local organization. So definitely, you know, check out the orgs that I dropped in the chat if you're looking for action steps, or if you're looking for, you know, how you can support trans people in a really tangible way. And, you know, look up in your community what those organizations are and who is really doing the work. So with that, I see that we have a question in the chat. And Ben, I don't know if you want to take that, or if you want me to take that. I can read the question. Would that be helpful?
I think the question you just answered, it's about resources for information, which we have your guidebook, and Brian sent another link, and all of these resources you sent as well.
Yeah, so beyond inviting a speaker, you know, where can you find that information? So yeah, definitely the list of orgs I just dropped. And in the chat, Brian, our trusty tech guru today, also put some links in for some Hummingbird guides that we've made. So we have an inclusive language guide on the Hummingbird site. that is a general resource. It's not necessarily LGBT specific, but there are LGBT kind of terminology in there. And then the Trans 101 resource guide, Ben and I actually co-created, and that gives a really kind of ground floor, foundational level, of how folks can support transgender folks in a more tangible way. Thank you, Brian, for dropping that list in the chat again. So yeah, with that, we have about 5 more minutes left of our time, and we'd love to hear if anyone does have any more questions. I know I'm an open book, and we'll answer anything about trans people, really, and about what workplaces can do. And I don't want to speak for Ben, but generally, Ben is too. So don't hesitate to ask questions. We are here for y'all. Oh, here's a good question. Do you want to answer this one, Ben, or do you want me to? What is the
I'll answer it.
common misconception about being trans?
I think the most common misconception is that being trans is like a staircase where there is a set start, a set end, and each part of transitioning is a set like level along a path. So for a while I had top surgery and I didn't want hormone therapy, and I wasn't like, okay, like there is a tendency to define trans people as pre-op or post-op, and like for me, I like as soon as I came out, I was trans enough, I was man enough. Like it wasn't waiting to like complete my transition. And when I had surgery and didn't want to have hormones, again, I wasn't incomplete. Like that was trans enough for me. And then I decided I wanted to go on hormones for a variety of reasons. And like so that doesn't like make me any more or less trans than anyone else. There are trans people who go through medical transition, trans people who don't, some people change their names, some people don't, and really highlighting that if there's a specific person you want to support, reach out to that person and say, what do you need and how can I support you? Because there's no one like, okay, once you transition, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like do all of these steps. And then ding, 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 you get the goal, you get a gold star when you get all 10 like punch card holes on the trans card and like do all of these things. So it's very like there is no one way that people transition.
Yeah, I think I love that answer because I think that is like the biggest one. And these are kind of like smaller misconceptions that I think they're still like important to name. I think another misconception that people have about trans people is that, we are only our suffering. And what I mean by that is, you so commonly when you hear about transgender people, especially if you're not a part of the LGBT community, the things that most straight people and the things that most cisgender people know about trans people are the statistics, right? Are that we're more likely to commit suicide, is that we face higher rates of workplace discrimination. The fact that transgender people, particularly transgender women of color, face incredibly high rates of hate crime violence and murders. And you only really hear the bad stuff, like the negative stuff that comes to being transgender. And like you don't, like cisgender people and straight people very rarely are exposed to or hear about like the ways that trans people are thriving and the ways that, quite frankly, trans people have always been thriving. Again, going back literally centuries and throughout the world. And the reason why trans people have always existed, have always thrived, is because we build community. We build communities, for out of necessity of safety, out of necessity of being able to access, just basic resources and beyond. And there are so many transgender people out there in the world that are thriving and that are really successful, that have families, that are parents, that are doctors, lawyers, politicians, whatever. But even, just trans people that aren't doctors or lawyers necessarily, but that are just living their life every single day, and that are working in their communities and, building those networks of mutual aid and building those networks of care amongst themselves and amongst their communities. And that's something for me as like a young transgender person, when I was 19 and like first came out, like I moved to Washington, D.C., and I worked in the LGBT movement. I worked at all these national organizations. And one of the reasons why it was really transformative for me and really powerful for me was because it was the first time I met like other successful trans people. It was the first time I met other happy trans people, because all I had ever heard was about like the pain and suffering of being a trans person and how hard my life would be and how I would never find a partner. And so I think that's like another really common misconception, is that like we are only our suffering. We are only the statistics that you hear, and trans people are so much more than that. And that's something that I really like want to highlight for folks, that like we are here and we are thriving and we always have been. So yeah, that's just like another thing I want to add. And thank you, David. Yes, thank you, David, for your feedback. I saw that in the chat, and for being here. And thank you to everybody for being here today. And I hope that, you know, folks really got something out of this session, that they're able to take back to their organizations to start creating these changes in small ways every day. So I don't know.
Found this on the web.
I don't know, Ben, if you want, sorry, that was my Siri on my watch. Ben, I don't know if you want to close us out.
I would love to actually invite Brian back in to come on and close us out.
Thanks so much, Ben and Bryce. I always learn so much from both of you, and am grateful that you spent some time with us sharing about your experiences and you know, additional perspectives on what companies can do to really make sure that they are being inclusive and respectful for all of their employees, and specifically for those employees who identify as transgender, non-binary, and genderqueer. And there's always something new. You know, Ben, one story that really stuck with me that you shared today was about the name changes of all of the different systems that the name change can really hit. And that's something I wouldn't have thought of before. I'm guessing our colleagues who have gotten married and chosen to change their names might be familiar with those challenges as well. So I think, you know, as one of the themes you shared is, yes, the conversation today was specifically around supporting the transgender community, and so many of those changes can support other communities as well. So that's something for us, I think that is a good reminder for all of us. So again, for all of you who are with us watching live or watching the recording later, next week we have a very special, first of all, thank you for being here. And next week we have a very special Hummingbird Hour centered around the representation matters. We're going to be releasing our first thought leadership paper, which includes some additional stories from Bryce and Ben as well, along with the incomparable Mita Malik and Bianca Chow, Jim Massey, and a college student that we recently met, Sanjana. So we're so excited to share that message, and hope you'll be with us next week. And our final Hummingbird Hour for June for Pride is June 29th, and that will feature Andre Herring and JEDI Valladares-Williams, who are going to talk about their experience in the LGBTQ plus community as queer people of color, and challenge us about how we can make Pride more inclusive. I think we have some work to do. So again, Bryce and Ben, thank you so much for being here. For all of you watching, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.